Fat girl sold to mountain man for $50. He said, best investment I ever made. Deadwood Springs, 1885. Beneath the flickering lamplight of the Rusty Nugget Saloon, the air reeked of whiskey and sweat. A crowd of rough men pressed shoulder to shoulder, their laughter cruel, their eyes hungry for spectacle. On the makeshift stage, Magnolia Maggie O'Brien stood trembling, her red hair glinting under the smoke-stained lanterns. At only 22, she carried the weight of shame and betrayal heavier than any sack of grain. Her stepfather, Silas Grimm, shoved her forward, his voice slurring as he shouted to the crowd, "Here she is, boys, plenty of flesh, strong enough to work a field or warm a bed. Who will start the bidding?" Laughter rippled through the room. Coins clinked against the tables. A man at the front sneered, "I'll give $30 for the fat Irish cow." The words cut deep, but Maggie refused to cry. Her hands clenched the torn hem of her dress. She would not let them see her break. "30!" Silas barked, grinning through broken teeth. "Do I hear more?" The crowd jeered, tossing out crude remarks, treating her dignity as a game. Maggie stared at the floorboards, praying the ordeal would end quickly, that somehow she might vanish into the smoke. And then, from the shadowed back of the saloon, a deep voice rolled like distant thunder. $50! The room fell silent. Heads turned. Out of the haze stepped a towering man in worn buckskins, his beard thick, his dark eyes unreadable. Tobias Bear McKenzie laid two $20 bills and a 10 on the table. Hard cash, more than any man there expected. "She's mine," he said simply. Gasps spread through the crowd. Maggie lifted her gaze, stunned. In that instant, for the first time all night, she felt the faintest spark of hope. Magnolia Maggie O'Brien had grown up learning to survive humiliation. Her mother, a soft-spoken Irish immigrant, died when Maggie was 16, leaving her with only a head of fiery hair and a body the townsfolk never let her forget. Where others her age danced at socials, Maggie carried buckets of water, mended clothes, and endured her stepfather's jeers. Silas Grimm had married her mother for convenience, and once widowed, saw Maggie only as a burden, or worse, as a possession to barter when his luck at cards turned sour. Maggie was not weak. She had shouldered years of back-breaking chores, coaxed crops from stubborn soil, and stitched hope into each threadbare dress. But each insult chipped away at her pride. The townsfolk called her the fat girl with no suitors. They whispered she would die alone, working herself into an early grave. She had long ago stopped hoping for kindness. Silas, meanwhile, gambled away every scrap of security Maggie worked to build. By the time of the auction, he owed Blackjack Morrison, Deadwood Springs' most feared outlaw, a sum too great to repay. To Silas, Maggie was currency. He dragged her to the Rusty Nugget as if she were cattle, shoving her onto the block with a callous grin. The jeers rained down thick. "She'll eat more than she's worth," someone hollered. "Who'd pay more than a dime?" another cackled. Each voice was a blade, each sneer a reminder of her supposed worthlessness. Maggie bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, vowing she would not give them the satisfaction of tears. Then came the voice, calm, steady, absolute. $50. Tobias Bear McKenzie emerged from the shadows, and every mocker fell silent. A giant of a man, broad-shouldered with hands roughened by years in the wild, he carried himself with a presence that commanded attention. Rumors swirled about him that he had killed men with his bare hands, that he had Indian blood, that he was half wild himself. Most townsfolk avoided him, muttering his name with suspicion. But that night, Bear did not look at Maggie with scorn. His dark eyes held no mockery, only certainty. He placed the money down in plain sight, a sum large enough to hush even the cruelest tongue. Silas snatched the cash with greedy hands, never sparing Maggie a glance. "She's yours," he told Bear, as if handing off a mule. Bear stepped forward and lifted Maggie gently from the stage. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of another's strength, used not to shove her down but to steady her. The room of drunken men parted as he guided her out into the cool night air. Maggie's heart pounded. She didn't know this man. She didn't know if she had leapt from one prison into another. But as Bear wrapped his own worn coat around her trembling shoulders, she realized something strange. He wasn't dragging her. He was shielding her. And in that moment, with the echo of jeers fading behind them, Maggie dared to believe her story might not end in chains after all. The saloon's din faded behind them as Bear led Maggie into the night air. The streets of Deadwood Springs were empty, save for the flickering lamplight and the crunch of his boots on gravel. Maggie's breath came shallow, the weight of the coat he had draped over her shoulders both comforting and bewildering. She dared a glance at him, this mountain man who had spent $50, a small fortune, to claim her. His profile was cut sharp against the moonlight, beard thick, eyes unreadable. He hadn't said a word since they left the saloon, and silence pressed heavy between them. At last he stopped before the general store. Maggie's brow furrowed in confusion. Was this where the nightmare began? But Bear strode inside and returned moments later, arms laden with a bundle, new boots, a thick wool dress, gloves, and a sack of provisions. He handed them to her without ceremony. "Yours," he said simply. Maggie's throat tightened. No one had bought her clothes since her mother died. She managed a shaky whisper. "Why?" His gaze held hers, steady and calm. "Because you'll freeze otherwise." The words were not tender, yet neither were they cruel. They were practical, protective, and for reasons she could not name, they settled something restless inside her chest. They left the town behind at dawn, two figures moving into the wilderness. The trail wound upward, snow lingering in the shaded gullies. Maggie stumbled often, her skirts tangled, her breath caught in her chest. Each time she faltered, Bear slowed. Once, when she slipped on a patch of ice, his arm caught her with such ease it was as though she weighed nothing at all. "I can walk," she insisted, cheeks burning. "I know," he replied, not releasing her until she steadied. Nights were colder still. Bear built campfires with practiced skill, his hands sure even as the wind whipped around them. He always laid her bedroll nearest the flames, then took his own spot several paces away. When she protested, ashamed to take the warmth while he shivered, he answered only, "I've known colder." The first time he handed her a tin of stew, Maggie hesitated. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but years of insults had trained her to shrink, to take less so no one could mock her appetite. Bear noticed her reluctance, and his brows knit. "Eat," he said. "You'll need strength for the climb." Something inside her cracked then. She ate, and he refilled her bowl without judgment. For the first time in memory, she finished a meal without shame. As the days passed, her fear shifted into something else. She began to notice the way Bear's silence was not the silence of menace, but of thoughtfulness. He asked if she needed rest before she could ask it herself. He adjusted the straps of her pack so it sat easier on her shoulders. He even cut branches to fashion a walking stick when the trail grew steep. Still, Maggie's heart wrestled with doubt. On the third evening, as snowflakes drifted down in the firelight, she found the courage to speak. "Why did you pay for me?" Bear looked into the flames, his expression unreadable. At length he answered, "Because I couldn't stand to see you sold to wolves." She swallowed hard. "So, what am I to you?" He finally turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Not property, not a burden. A woman with fire enough to stare down a room of jackals without breaking. The best $50 I ever spent." Her breath caught. For a moment, the mountains themselves seemed to hush, as though listening. She didn't know what lay ahead in his cabin, didn't know if she could trust the fragile warmth flickering between them. But she did know this. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen more than her size. And on that winding trail into the wilderness, hope began to take root. The cabin appeared just as dusk sank behind the ridges. Solid timbers stacked high, smoke curling steady from a stone chimney. Maggie stopped short, expecting a hunter's den littered with bones or a shack dark with filth. Instead, Bear pushed the heavy door open to reveal a space tidy and warm. A fire roared in the hearth, its glow spilling across a wooden table scarred by use but polished clean. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of herbs, sacks of flour, and neat bundles of pelts. A rocking chair sat by the window, beside a stack of books, and astonishingly, a weathered piano tucked in the corner. Maggie blinked. "This is yours?" Bear shrugged, setting down their packs. "Home enough." For the first time since the auction, she let out a shaky laugh. It wasn't the prison she feared, it was a refuge. The first days in the cabin tested her nerves. She rose each morning expecting demands, orders, or worse. Instead, Bear went about his chores silently, splitting logs in the yard, mending snares, or hauling water from the stream. When he brought back game, he simply set it on the counter and stepped aside as though waiting for her choice of what to cook. "You don't expect me to—" Maggie gestured uncertainly to the meat one afternoon. "You cook how you like," he said, "or not at all. I can manage." The freedom startled her. Out of habit, she began cooking, using herbs she found on the shelves. When she placed a steaming stew before him, she half expected criticism. Instead, Bear took a spoonful, nodded once, and said, "Better than I've made in years." Something in her chest warmed at the plain praise. Evenings became their quiet ritual. Bear would carve wood by the fire, his large hand shaping small animals and birds with surprising delicacy. Maggie would sew or sweep, then sometimes sit at the old piano, pressing tentative keys. The first time she played a halting Irish lullaby her mother once sang, Bear paused his carving. His eyes softened, and when she faltered, he said simply, "Don't stop." Gradually, Maggie found herself laughing again. Once, when Bear returned from the woods soaked after slipping into the creek, she couldn't hold back a giggle. His stern face cracked into a rare smile, deep lines etching at the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she realized how handsome he could be when his guard slipped. But the cabin was not only warmth, it was work. Bear insisted she try splitting wood. He placed the axe in her hands, steadying her grip. "You won't break it," he said when she hesitated. She swung awkwardly, the log splitting only slightly, but Bear nodded with approval. Again, Her muscles ached, her palms blistered, but each success filled her with pride. When she managed a clean split, Bear's grin spread wide, and she felt a glow that had nothing to do with the fire. He also showed her how to mend traps, how to salt meat, how to gather herbs for teas. Never once did he treat her as clumsy or useless. Instead, he worked beside her, correcting gently, patient as stone. And Maggie, who had lived years being called burden and shame, began to see herself differently in his eyes. One night, as snow pattered softly outside, she whispered, "Why are you so kind to me?" Bear set down his carving, gaze fixed on the flames. "Because you've known enough cruelty." After a pause, he added, "And because kindness is never wasted." Her throat tightened. She turned toward him, the firelight catching his profile. For a moment, she wanted to say more, to thank him, to ask if he could ever care for her beyond gratitude. But words failed, and she pressed them down. Instead, she let the quiet hold them both, the fire crackling, the storm murmuring beyond the walls. In that cabin, high on the ridge, Maggie found not just shelter from winter, but the beginning of something she had thought forever lost, the possibility of belonging. Spring crept slowly into the mountains, thawing streams and softening the earth. Maggie had begun to hum as she worked, her hands steady over pots and stitches, her laughter sometimes filling the cabin. Bear listened in silence, though a quiet ease settled in him he hadn't known in years. But peace never lingers long. It began with the riders. Maggie spotted them first, dark figures moving along the valley floor, their horses restless under the weight of rifles. She stiffened. Who are they? Bear's jaw tightened. Black Jack's men. The name alone carried menace. Maggie remembered the cruel eyes of the man who had taken her stepfather's debt. Why are they here? They're hunting more than gold, Bear said grimly. He didn't explain further, but his shoulders carried the weight of old battles. That night, unable to sleep, Maggie pressed him for the truth. "You've been hiding something." He sat by the fire, shadows carving his face into granite. At last, he spoke. "My name isn't Tobias Mackenzie, not truly. It's Theodore Bartholomew Mackenzie III, Boston-born, son of a shipping magnate." Maggie blinked. The revelation felt like a thunderclap. "I had wealth, family, a wife," Bear continued, his voice raw. "War stripped most of it away. Greed did the rest. I came west, thinking I could build something honest. I found love again, an Indian woman named Ahiv. The army burned her village. She died in my arms. Since then, I wanted nothing more than silence." The weight of his confession pressed heavy between them. Maggie reached across the table, her hand trembling as it touched his. "I'm sorry." Bear's eyes flicked to hers, dark with old pain. "Black Jack knows who I am. He believes I buried treasure in these hills. He'll come for it, and for anyone standing with me." The following days grew tense. Maggie noticed signs. Boot prints in the snow, a snare cut clean, the feeling of eyes on her back when she carried water. She also heard whispers in town, cruel rumors spread by Black Jack himself. "She's no wife," one woman sneered when Maggie passed through for supplies. "Bought for coin like cattle." "She's fat and foolish," another said. "Only a fool like Mackenzie would pay for that." The words stung, reopening wounds she thought healing. But Maggie straightened her spine, remembering Bear's steady voice. Kindness is never wasted. When she returned to the cabin, Bear saw the red in her eyes. "What did they say?" "That I was bought." Her voice shook. "That I'm not worth even the $50 you paid." Bear's face hardened, but not at her. "You listen to me, Maggie O'Brien." He stepped closer, his voice low and fierce. "That night in the saloon, I didn't buy you. I freed you, and if I had to spend every coin I ever earned to keep you safe, I'd call it the best bargain of my life." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they carried no shame. Still, danger pressed nearer. One evening, a bullet shattered the cabin window, embedding itself in the mantel above the fire. Bear shoved Maggie to the floor, his gun drawn before the echo faded. Outside, hoofbeats thundered into the night. "They're testing us," Bear muttered. "They'll be back." Fear curled tight in Maggie's stomach, yet beneath it lay something new. Steel. She was no longer the trembling girl on an auction block. She had learned to split wood, to cook for survival, to endure. And now she would learn to fight. "Teach me," she said firmly, lifting her chin. "If they come again, I won't hide behind you." Bear studied her, pride flickering in his eyes. "Then we'll stand together." In the fire's glow, with shadows of violence gathering beyond the mountains, their fragile peace hardened into resolve. The battle was coming, and Maggie, once discarded as worthless, would face it at Bear's side. The night they came, the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. A blood-red moon hung above the ridges as the crunch of hooves and the jangle of spurs echoed up the trail. Maggie stood by the hearth, shotgun clutched tight in her trembling hands. Bear loaded his rifle with calm precision, though his jaw was hard as stone. "They'll try fear first," he said. "Don't give it to them." The cabin door rattled as a voice bellowed outside. "Mackenzie, come out and hand over the girl and the gold, and maybe we'll let you live." Bear threw the door wide, stepping into the cold night. His massive frame filled the threshold, rifle steady in his grip. Maggie, heart-pounding, followed him. Blackjack Morrison sat astride a black stallion, his scarred face twisted in a cruel grin. Behind him, a dozen riders raised torches, their shadows dancing against the trees. "You should have stayed in your hole, Bear," Blackjack sneered. "Now I'll take your woman and your fortune both." Maggie's chest tightened at the word woman. To Blackjack, it was mockery. But to her, standing with Bear, it felt like truth. "You'll take nothing," Bear growled. "This land, this cabin, this woman, they're mine to protect." Laughter rang out, harsh and ugly. Blackjack lifted his hand, and the night erupted in gunfire. Bear dropped to one knee, firing with deadly precision. 2 riders fell before they reached the porch. Maggie braced the shotgun against her shoulder the way Bear had taught her, firing once, twice. The kick nearly knocked her off her feet, but the look of shock on a bandit's face as he tumbled from his saddle gave her courage. Bullets shattered windows, torches arced through the air. Flames licked the cabin wall. Bear cursed, dragging a blanket to smother the fire before it spread. Maggie reloaded with shaking fingers, sweat and smoke stinging her eyes. Then Blackjack himself dismounted, striding forward with pistol drawn. "You can't hide behind her forever, Mackenzie," he snarled. He lunged, seizing Maggie by the arm, yanking her forward as a shield. The cold press of steel touched her temple. Bear froze, rifle aimed but finger slack on the trigger. His eyes locked on hers, steady, unflinching. And Maggie, heart hammering, remembered every lesson, every word he'd spoken. "You are not a burden. You are fire enough to stare down jackals." With a cry, she drove her elbow back, slamming into Blackjack's ribs. He staggered, grip loosening just enough. Bear's shot cracked through the night, and Blackjack dropped, his pistol clattering to the dirt. The remaining riders fled into the trees, their courage broken. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of smoldering torches. Bear lowered his rifle, breath ragged. He crossed the yard in 2 strides, pulling Maggie into his arms. "You saved us both," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, thick with something more than relief. For the first time, Maggie didn't feel like a woman rescued. She felt like a partner, standing equal in a fight for their lives. By dawn, the mountain lay quiet again. Smoke curled lazily from the cabin's chimney, the only sign of the night's violence. Bear had repaired the shattered window, his big hand steady despite the bandage on his arm. Maggie moved softly around the kitchen, brewing coffee, her hair lit gold in the early light. They sat together at the rough-hewn table, the silence between them no longer heavy with fear, but full of unspoken truths. Bear reached across, covering her hand with his calloused palm. "I called you mine out there," he said at last. His eyes, usually shadowed, were open now, vulnerable. "But the truth is, you're not mine unless you want to be." Maggie swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. She thought of the saloon, of being paraded like livestock, of the laughter that had followed her every step in Deadwood Springs. Then she looked at Bear, the man who had bought her freedom with $50 and given her back her worth without asking anything in return. "I want to be," she whispered, "if you'll still have me." Bear's mouth curved into the first true smile she'd ever seen on him. "Best investment I ever made," he said softly, voice thick with emotion. Outside, the sun rose higher, painting the mountains in fire and gold. Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder, safe in the warmth of the man beside her. Yet beyond the ridges, the world still waited, laws to reckon with, whispers to silence, dangers not yet gone. Could love forged in fire and fear withstand the weight of that world? The question lingered in the still morning air unanswered, like the promise of a new day. Stories like Maggie and Bear's remind us that love often rises where the world least expects it. She was mocked, betrayed, and sold like property. Yet in the arms of a mountain man, she discovered not just safety, but dignity and strength. He called her the best investment he ever made, and together they proved that hearts can't be measured in dollars. I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Your words remind me how stories travel across borders, carrying hope. And if you still believe love conquers scorn, don't leave. The next tale is waiting for you.